Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining me, the HBS Club of the GCC and the HBS MENA Research Center today, in welcoming Colleen Ammerman as she joins us today to launch her newly published co-authored book, Glass Half Broken, Shattering Barriers That Still Hold Women Back at Work. Colleen is the director of the Gender Initiative at Harvard Business School. She works with faculty leadership to support a research community and a platform for disseminating practice-relevant insights for advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion in organizations. She co-authored the book, Glass Half Broken, Shattering the Barriers That Still Hold Women Back at Work with Boris, Grooysberg. Why the gender gap persists and how can we close it? For years, women have made up the majority of college-educated workers in the United States. In 2019, the gap between the percentage of women and the percentage of men in the workforce was the smallest on record. But despite these statistics, women remain underrepresented in positions of power and status, with the highest paying jobs, the most gender imbalanced, even in fields where the numbers of men and women are roughly equal, or where women actually make up the majority. Leadership ranks remain male-dominated. The persistence of these inequalities begs the question, why haven't we made progress? Colleen, over to you.
Thank you, Raja. So that's a great place to start, is why we're in this situation. And that's one of the reasons that my co-author, Professor Boris Grooysberg, and I wrote this book, is to try to understand, even though we have made a lot of progress, we still are in this situation where women are quite dramatically underrepresented in leadership. And so that's one of the things that we did, was kind of try to dig into that and then understand what that says about what we should do to change the status quo. So I will, spend a few minutes kind of sharing a little bit with you about our research and kind of where it led us to think in terms of, what are the reasons. Although I'm very interested to hear, after you hear from me, if you think some of these reasons look different in this region. So very interested kind of to hear feedback and reflections on that, if some of it you think is a bit different. But I'll share my screen and start off with actually giving you just a little bit of extra context on the Gender Initiative. So I work really closely with our faculty chair, Professor Robin Ely, who's a really eminent scholar of both race and gender in organizations. And there are actually several dozen other faculty at the school, who do research, teaching, or who are otherwise kind of deeply engaged on these topics. And actually, I do want to say, kind of to that point, this book, Boris's and my work, is really just one little kind of slice of the work that's being produced from the Gender Initiative and from this amazing community of scholars. So this slide is just kind of a snapshot of a bunch of different headlines from the past couple of years, showing what that breadth and depth of research is from my really amazing colleagues. I do want to also say a little bit quickly about my co-author, who's not here with us today. And many of you may know him. So in addition to being a really terrific gender researcher, he's very much a sort of male champion for gender equity. So aside from the work that he and I do together, he's written dozens of teaching cases on women leaders across pretty much every industry. He also created an MBA course called How Star Women Succeed for the elective curriculum that focuses on career management and inclusive leadership. And he also founded and co-chairs the school's Executive Education Women on Boards program. And he and I met back in 2012. A lot of you may remember when the school did this whole year of activities and events and commemorative stuff around the 50th anniversary of women actually being admitted to the MBA program at HBS. So that's when he and I met, and we started working together. And over the years, as we continued to kind of dive deeper into this work and think about these topics, decided to write this book. And I'll quickly tell you just a little bit about what went into it. So we went back to the research, really going back to some of the earliest research on gender in the white collar workplace in the 1970s, and then really kind of tried to survey and get a sense of what the research says across a bunch of different social science fields, and really synthesize that and make that very actionable and accessible to readers. And then we also did a bunch of our own new research, which you see on the right side of the slide, both quantitative and qualitative. So we did surveys with women who have achieved senior leadership across pretty much every industry and globally around the world. And then we also did many, many, many interviews. Boris and I joke that we never would have started this book if we realized how much work it was going to be. And when we added up kind of toward the end of the process, how many interviews had been done by us or by colleagues and research assistants, we were kind of stunned to see that it was over 300. But again, it gave us a really, great breadth of understanding. And one of the things that we really focused on was trying to talk to women across kind of the whole career cycle, right? So both, including people who are just starting out, and then all the way to women who were, on corporate boards at that highest level of leadership. And we talked to men as well. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why we wrote this book, which I think is quite obvious, but is still a bit helpful. So as I don't think, I need to tell all of you, women are ready to lead. However, leadership is lacking women, right? This is the problem. And these statistics you see here are US focused, but really across the world, this is a persistent pattern. Women are just underrepresented kind of any way you slice it in terms of leadership positions, from just basic managerial positions, and then certainly as you go further and further up the hierarchy. And, you can dig into the data on this, and I could show you, lots more numbers, and we could look at numbers sort of specific to the region, which I know that Raja is going to share a little bit about the context in the UAE in particular. But I think one thing that kind of drives this home is actually to hear this in the voices of people who have experienced these kinds of barriers. And this is one woman that we spoke to, this quote, who actually had quite a stellar career. We spoke to her when she was a senior executive, so she had actually been quite successful. But she was talking to us and kind of reflecting back, on her career. And she said, "I'm absolutely certain that if I had been a man, both in the way I would have behaved and in the way I would have been perceived, I would have definitely had a more rapid career. I can't say that I'm unhappy with the result of it, but I think I would have liked to reach the level I am today in my 40s rather than in my late 50s. And I definitely think that gender played a role." And I know we also have some, Raja has some great questions in addition. So like I said, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the why, right? Why we're in this situation. And then I think we're going to get into in conversation a little more of the solutions and what do we do about it. So the why. We sort of came up with 3 sort of myths or misconceptions that we think are tending to drive this continued underrepresentation. And the next thing I was going to show you after showing you that quote is an interesting finding to juxtapose with that quote. So that quote was right from a woman who said, "Even though I've been so successful, I can see how gender did present some barriers and kind of was a drag on my career, right? I wasn't necessarily moving at the velocity that I could have been." And on the next slide, what I have is a finding from a study a few years ago. And one of the results is that 2/3 of the male executives who were surveyed in this study said that they believed that if they had been women, their careers would have turned out the same. So that's kind of a disconnect, right? You have a senior woman, right, sort of a peer of theirs saying, "I see how gender placed some barriers before me in my career advancement." And then you have men sort of not really seeing that. And I don't actually think that's because the men in that survey don't believe in gender parity, don't want to see more women in leadership in their companies. I actually think that the vast majority, if not all of those men, very much do want to see more gender equity and do want to see more women in leadership. I think where that kind of disconnect comes from is a lack of understanding of why and what really happens in women's careers. That is driving this underrepresentation, which of course makes it hard to know how to fix it, right? So we identified sort of 3 common, what I would call myths or misconceptions. So the first one is this notion that what we really need to focus on is sort of improving women, right? Sort of equipping women to be able to compete in the workplace. And there's lots of books about this, right? Lean In is a great example. And Lean In, I actually don't want to denigrate. I think there's a real place for that kind of advice to help women navigate the reality as it exists. The problem is that when we focus so much on what we need to do to improve women, we don't talk enough or focus enough on what we need to do to improve the workplace itself, right? And so some of this advice helps women overcome those barriers, but it leaves the barriers themselves intact when we don't actually get to the root causes. And this can be really impactful and kind of insidious for women early in their careers. So one of the groups that we interviewed was women who were about to graduate college. And we spoke to those same women about a year later, when they had kind of, just getting started in their first jobs. And then we also spoke to them about 5 years later when they were a little bit more into their careers, but still early on. And very quickly, actually, oftentimes at that very first interview, so a year or less into that first job, they started to see some of these barriers. And these are women who did not really anticipate a lot of gender bias or gender discrimination, which makes sense when you think about their educational experience. Their schooling had been quite gender equal. They had been really empowered and really encouraged. And so didn't really, think they would face a lot of barriers in the workplace. But that changed very quickly. And they started to kind of see some of these subtle things that suggested the playing field really wasn't level. One we spoke to, a quote I would have shown was this woman who went to a top college, then went to a top law school, and then joined a large law firm. And for the first time I spoke to her when she was about to graduate college and was getting ready to go to law school, she was very excited to be a lawyer and really excited to kind of be part of a generation of women who were going to change what that partnership rank at the top looked like, which is still very male dominated in law. And just really saw, her trajectory as one where she and her peers, as they moved into their careers and kind of the generational change happened, would be the ones to make that partnership level more gender balanced. Unfortunately, when I spoke to her for the last time, when she had been out of law school for a few years and was working at a large firm, I'll paraphrase the quote, but basically she said, it's starting to get to me, especially the 40th time a man speaks to you with a lack of respect for you and your time and your work. And it gets to a certain volume and a certain point where you have to realize it's not coincidental, right? She was basically saying, I'm realizing I can't write some of this off as just, oh, that guy's having a bad day or he's kind of a jerk. It's more of a culture where I'm not really valued. I'm not really seen as valuable as a lot of my male peers, right? And that was very, very painful for her. So again, the point here is that what we need to do is not fix women, but fix the workplace. The second sort of myth or misconception is one that really hits women hard in kind of that mid-career point around the time that a lot of people become parents, right? And this is a sort of a notion that the reason that we see a lack of women in leadership and the reason we have this leaky pipeline to leadership, as it's often called, is really the result of women's choices and the fact that the notion that women don't want to pursue leadership, right? That they would prefer not to attain those senior positions and they would prefer to focus on different things in life. The problem with this belief is that an enormous body of research demonstrates that it's really just not correct. It's really not true. What is true, this research demonstrates, is that organizations make it very hard for women after they do become parents to continue to advance in their careers. So a lot of what looks like sort of opting out or a choice to kind of ratchet back your career really is more about being pushed out or feeling devalued by your organization and therefore becoming kind of less engaged in your work. And the particular sort of example that I like to draw on, around this misconception is this really powerful quote from a woman who told us, look, when I told my employer that I was pregnant, I was demoted. I was moved from a team of managing 30 people to managing 6 people. And several of the people who had been reporting to me were put at my level. It was very clear that it was a demotion, right? And this is a woman who had been identified as a high potential. The company had paid for her MBA. She was very much on a fast track and very, invested in her career. But as soon as she alerted her employer that she was moving to this new status as a parent, as a mother, even before she actually had her child, she very quickly got this message that she was less valuable as an employee, right? And in pretty stark terms. So that's the second sort of myth or misconception. And the third one, the final one that I'll talk about, is really about what affects women who do make it to leadership, right? So those women who kind of survive this gauntlet, right? The women who are the survivors and kind of make it to the top. And there is, this notion or this belief that for those women, we really shouldn't be talking about gender bias or gender barriers. That once they've gotten to a certain point, to sort of, call out gender discrimination or gender bias at that level is sort of sour grapes, or it's just once women get to that point, they can really finally focus on their jobs, and gender is not so much of a factor. However, this is another area where we just know that's not true, right? So women in leadership are subject to all kinds of heightened scrutiny, also the kind of issue of likability, which I imagine many women listening have faced, right? And kind of the trade-offs there. And what I like to show sometimes when I have a slide around this is a kind of a gallery of women in the United States who've been a very high profile women who were pushed out of a job, a top job, or were not able to kind of advance to a next level of leadership they were aiming for. And across kind of the industry spectrum, across the political spectrum, just some reminders of the fact that women in leadership, in fact, are also not on an equal playing field with their male peers. So those are kind of what we found in doing this work to be three really sort of key misconceptions that lead to bad advice for companies about how to tackle this problem. And so what we did, what we do in the book, after kind of taking you through these myths and kind of taking you through what is the state of gender equity at work today, we move to, okay, what are solutions that really are evidence-based, right? What are recommendations that can actually move the needle and address those underlying drivers of gender inequality? So I'll stop there. That's a little bit of a why this problem persists, and then I think we can get into what to do about it.
Thank you, Colleen. Very, very interesting insights. In the book, you say we should no longer be satisfied with seeing individual women break through the barriers. Instead, organizations should clear the way for women. The comprehensive look at the gender gap is as loud call for corporate leaders to make some serious changes. Where do you think they should start?
Yeah, I mean, one thing we really wanted to do was present this kind of holistic approach, right? So, we like to say that a lot, that Boris and I, we've had decades now, a lot of individual women breaking through those barriers, right? And kind of being role models and, showing other women that it is possible, right? And that's great. And that's, gotten us far. And we've got a lot of individual women kind of, fighting for policies and practices that will advance gender equity. But what we need now is to kind of move from that to a much more holistic approach, right? Where organizations really take this up as something that they can address systematically. So we talk about in the book sort of three key components of an evidence-based approach. So one is the role of men. I'm happy to kind of talk in more detail about that, if questions come up about that. But one is the idea of really fully engaging men in the project of gender equity, and really for men to understand that gender inequality is not a women's issue or a women's problem. It's actually a societal issue, and it's something that we all have a stake in. The second component is really managers at kind of the individual level. So we have a chapter that looks at what it means to be an inclusive manager. Because at the end of the day, you can have great processes and great systems, but if you don't have people who are committed to investing in them and implementing them and themselves doing the work to be inclusive and equitable, you're going to have kind of limited progress. And the third thing is really around those organizational systems, because you need both the structure and then you need the managers to kind of adopt it and implement it, kind of that cultural piece. But it's really important to have the structures in place. And we actually know a lot about kind of where bias and where structural barriers come in to management processes So we present kind of a framework that looks at the whole life cycle of an employee, going all the way back to before she's even hired, when she's kind of being recruited into an applicant pool, and then all the way through all the processes an employee goes through, right? Hiring and promotion and evaluation, and really kind of applying what we know from research to understand how to kind of mitigate or de-bias all of those different processes. So it's really about this holistic approach at the end of the day.
But there are tactical strategies that organizations and managerial strategies that are designed to weaken and ultimately break down these barriers. What would you start with as which strategies to tackle first? We know it's a complex structure, but since you've identified the barriers, I'm sure that there are strategies or focus areas that will enable us to start somewhere.
Absolutely. And so it's really important to kind of think about how we can diagnose where bias and barriers come into these different processes. And that's why we, in the book, really go into each of these processes. So we take you through, recruiting applicants, to hiring, to integrating an employee, to, again, the process of evaluation, promotion and compensation, and long-term retention. And, I obviously will not go into a granular level of detail here, but there really are very specific actions that you can take to kind of either take bias out of those processes, or to educate the people who implement these processes about how to do it equitably. One kind of general principle is around transparency. So just as a general rule, bringing more transparency to processes often underlies the solutions and the ways to mitigate bias. So take negotiation, for instance. The research on negotiation, which of course happens in all kinds of work contexts, right? Obviously from hiring to maybe going up for a promotion, but even for other types of situations like an assignment. All the research shows that the more kind of ambiguity and lack of clarity and kind of opacity around the terms of the negotiation, what's up for negotiation, the more that gender disparities come into play, right? And the more unequal outcomes you have, the more ambiguous the conditions of negotiation are. And when you actually bring clarity and transparency to the parameters of that negotiation, women actually perform just as well as men, right? So that's just one example, but in general, bringing more transparency to all of these processes is one of the most helpful things that you can do. The other thing I would say is really about, framing sort of a shared mission around overcoming the biases that we have. So a lot of companies are doing education about bias, gender and racial and other kinds of bias, be it unconscious or explicit. And that's great, right? It's really important for people to be educated about that. But if we don't frame that as something that as a company, we all kind of have a responsibility to overcome and reflect on, and it's something that should be, safe to bring up and discuss and sort of question, is there some bias happening in the way that we're talking about this employee versus that employee? If you don't set those conditions where everyone feels invested in overcoming the bias, then you've really stopped far short of where you can go. So those are kind of two general principles that can help you across all of these processes.
Thank you, Colleen. I would like also to take this opportunity to do a regional context. So just to give a quick look about what has happened in the UAE in the last few years. This year, the UAE became the MENA regional leader in supporting women economic empowerment, according to the World Bank 2021 Women Business and Law Report. Gender equality and diversity is an initiative. It's an important initiative that's being supported by the government, and a lot of organizations are also supporting. The UAE has been known to pass laws in favor of women empowerment, including mandatory representation of at least one woman on boards of publicly listed companies, and this happened last month, really, which is really great. Nearly 30% of the UAE government structure is headed by Emirati women. And most recently, Sarah Al-Amiri, the Minister of State of Advanced Technology, the chairwoman of the UAE Space Agency, was named as Time Magazine's Top 100 Emerging Leaders, following her role as one of the drivers behind the UAE National Historic Hope Probe mission. If we look at Saudi as well, there have been a lot of reforms, especially in 2019, where the study found that the kingdom enacted reforms in 6 out of 8 indicators associated with the women economic empowerment. 2019 was a year of groundbreaking reforms that allowed women greater economic opportunity in Saudi. The amendments adopted protect women from discrimination in employment, to prohibit employers from dismissing women during their pregnancy or maternity leave, and to prohibit gender-based discrimination accessing financial services, and also equalize the retirement age of women and men at 60 years. And in 2019, Saudi Arabia women above 21 no longer needed permission from a male guardian to travel or obtain a passport, which is great. And in 2020, 10 new female leadership appointments happened in the Saudi government, including Rania Nashar, who is the advisor of the CEO of PIF, and Sarah Suhaimi, who heads Tadawul. So there's a lot of developments that are happening in the region that are contributing to the overall agenda of inclusion and diversity. But it's really interesting to look at it from an organizational perspective and how to really navigate through. We can talk about how women empowerment is one of the hot topics in the Gulf, and empowerment has been achieved at different levels in Gulf countries. Given the differences in local politics and social circumstances, the region boasts the highest education rates for women in the Arab world. Gulf women are also more educated than Gulf men. However, unconscious bias against women remain. How can we break those biases, in your view?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, that's also true in the US in terms of education. Women have been earning the majority of college and graduate degrees for decades. And that's actually true, even if you break it down like by different racial and ethnic groups in the US, that women are more educated. And yet, you know, we do see these disparities. You know, so I think there's a number of things. And what you were just saying about some of the kind of legal and policy level changes in the region in the past few years are really important, because I think it reminds us that this is a problem that needs a multi-pronged and sort of all hands on deck approach, right? There are sort of public policy level remedies that are really important. Then there's what organizations and individuals can do, which is what Boris's and my work is focused on. You know, so I think what I would say is, you know, in terms of how we can start to break down these biases, all of these things can work together. So for instance, there's actually research that shows that when we do change laws, for instance, like the requirement around the representation of women on boards in the UAE, which there's also several US states that have enacted similar mandates. And then of course, you know, countries in Europe, that, you know, for a number of years, there's actually research that shows that those kinds of laws can shift people's sort of beliefs and expectations, right? So we don't always need to wait for people's beliefs to change and then see that reflected in law. We actually sometimes, by making these big kind of, you know, policy decisions, can start to shift the conversation and shift people's understanding, right? And I think you can see why, or you can intuitively sense why, if you create some conditions where women can be more prominent, right? Can, for instance, sit on these very powerful boards or be in public life in new ways, people can kind of start to get a more expansive vision of what's possible for women, right? And that creates sort of a positive feedback loop. And then I think there's a big role for the private sector to play, for organizations to play, right? To kind of, again, push the conversation forward. So for instance, in the US, you know, we, unlike most of the rest of the developed world, certainly don't have sort of strong national level policies around parental leave for men or women, right? And actually, we know from research that providing men and women equal parental leave is very important for gender equality. However, a lot of companies in the US are out ahead of kind of our federal government on this issue, right? And these big companies can make a real difference, both for their employees, right, in providing this equal maternity and paternity leave, which is where companies are going. But also that starts to send a message to broader society and sends a message to policymakers about where we need to go socially. So, I would just say, I think that all of these kind of pieces can work together. And so, for all of you listening, it's really about what's your sphere of influence, right? Where can you play a role to advance these goals? Is that within your company as a manager? Is that, as a citizen, or, in your community, in your family, right? We all have these kind of different spheres of influence where we can be change agents. So I think kind of seizing those opportunities and all of us doing that is what's going to kind of can get us farther.
Thank you, Colleen. With the aim of gender diversity, if an organization decides to hire talented women, what should be the main responsibility of managers starting from the hiring process? And as managers, how can we support these talented women as they climb the ladder?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so definitely there's a ton in our book about this. And one thing I would encourage managers to think about is really, reframing it away from just how can I support women to how can I kind of leverage female talent as a competitive advantage, right? Because if you are not fully leveraging the talent of half the population, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage, right? It's just sort of doesn't make sense from a strategic position. And so there is definitely a lot that you can do when it comes to hiring. So, we provide some details about this, but actually even how you write a job description can be really important in terms of if you want to make sure that qualified women apply for that job in the first place, right? So there's things you can do even in the language of how you talk about the role to make sure that you're not sort of inadvertently depriving yourself of the whole pool of women, men and women who could potentially excel at this job. And then certainly once you get women in the door, it's really all about thinking about how you can equitably and inclusively, again, leverage and develop your talent, right? So, one thing that we heard about a lot in our interviews was women having this experience of male managers sort of, in a well-meaning but misguided way, trying to protect them by not offering them certain opportunities and assignments, and this happens particularly when women have young kids and their male managers think, well, I'm not going to offer her this potential job posting that would require a relocation, or it's like an incredibly difficult client and, would require a lot of long hours. We heard about this from a lot of women who said, I understand he was trying to be helpful, but at the end of the day, that really deprived me of the agency and the opportunity to make those decisions for myself about how I wanted to navigate career and life, and also meant that I wasn't getting exactly the kinds of opportunities that you need to advance, right? I wasn't getting the stretch assignments and the kind of visibility opportunities that some of my male peers are. So that's, just one little piece of advice that I would give to managers to really think about, when you're distributing opportunities, think with an objective lens about who's, best positioned for that, and then give people the opportunity to make those decisions for themselves about whether they want to take on a challenging assignment.
Absolutely. Colleen, there is a question from Paul Epping, and he says, and I've heard this question before, so I'll be excited to know your view. He says an HBR article in 2018 stated that shareholders are reluctant to invest if women are on the board of these companies because they think that the focus will be more on social aspects, jeopardizing performance. What's your take?
Yeah, I've seen that research, right? It's quite interesting. And I think this is one of those things that, like I said, is part of this long-term process of shifting some of these norms and stereotypes. So I think we can all kind of think through why investors might make that assumption, right? There are these beliefs both about women and about companies that sort of prioritize gender equity, right? So beliefs about women being that, they are as leaders sort of more communally oriented, less, focused on, their own advancement, more other oriented as compared to men. And actually the research and evidence doesn't really bear out those differences, but we have these strong beliefs about men and women as being kind of fundamentally different, right? And then we make sort of assumptions or attributions about the decisions they'll make, right? Or kind of, what they'll pursue. And there's a great HBR article by Professor Ely, actually, from a couple of years ago called What Most People Get Wrong About Men and Women, that actually dives into the research to understand pretty much all these things that we believe are very different about men and women just aren't there in the data, aren't there in the research. It's really more about kind of our expectations. So that's one piece. The other piece, right, is people's expectations about companies that prioritize gender equity, right? They're going to do that at the expense of other kinds of goals, right, around performance. And there's a great book that I would recommend for anybody interested in that topic called The 360-Degree Organization by Sarah Kaplan, who's a professor at the Rotman School at the University of Toronto, that really dives into this idea of trade-offs between kind of, you know, what are often called ESG goals, like around, you know, social responsibility and environmental responsibility and performance. And she really kind of has a great set of recommendations around getting out of this paradigm of the zero-sum mindset. And you know, I won't, you know, you can read her book, but I think it's a great way to kind of get into this question. And my hope, and I think, you know, this is likely to be true as we do move to a place where women are more represented on boards, some of these expectations will fall away. And I think that, you know, if we do that study were conducted maybe 10 years from now, I think it might be a little bit different. But a lot of these beliefs are very deeply embedded. So it really is a process of making change to kind of bring society along to thinking about gender differently.
Thank you, Colleen. Another interesting question from Ihab Ismail. He's saying, how do you explain the presence of women on top of companies like Coca-Cola, IBM, HP, Xerox, and others? What are the things that made them reach such positions?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we actually have a whole chapter on women like that, right, who actually make it to these senior roles. And what are the things that contributed to that, right? So I definitely, you know, think that'll be of interest to people interested in this question. But here's kind of what we found in a nutshell. So one of the things certainly is that they actively cultivated their resilience. So it's not just that they were resilient, but they actually realized that, look, I am going to experience some barriers, right? And, you know, we heard lots of stories about what exactly that was like for them. And this is women, you know, in a whole bunch of different industries, you know, all the way from, you know, healthcare or media, you know, where women are more represented, to women, you know, we spoke to who were in like mining and energy, and, you know, one of very, very few women, right? And the whole kind of gamut. But they all said, you know, I realized early on that I needed to very actively kind of cultivate my own belief in myself, my own resilience, and my willingness to like get back up when I am pushed back, or I do, you know, or I just have a failure, right? As we all do in our careers. Like, not everything that the best of us even do, you know, is perfect. So they really cultivated that actively. But they also realized that there was a interplay between the extent to which they could cultivate that in themselves and their environment. And so they were really careful about vetting their employers. And also, if they found themselves in an environment where they did feel really devalued or really felt diminished, or like this is an environment where women really can't succeed, they got out of those environments as quickly as they could, because they realized that, you know, ultimately that was really going to kind of tear down their confidence, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is certainly being very kind of direct about what their goals were. So many of them said that, you know, their managers or their bosses often made assumptions, kind of like the assumption I just mentioned about, you know, oh, we wouldn't want this, you know, opportunity, you know, that would have required, you know, moving across the country or you know, moving, you know, across the world. You know, but this was broader than that, really saying I got very specific and explicit with my supervisor, with my managers over the years about where I wanted to go. So not just saying, well, I'd like to stay with the company and continue to contribute and continue to advance, but being really concrete and saying, well, you know, I'd like to be running this line of business ultimately, right? And so that they all kind of consistently said being really direct and specific about where they wanted to go was really critical. So there's a lot more in that chapter, but those are just a couple of things that from the senior women we spoke to, they found kind of enabled them to keep advancing, as, you know, a lot of their peers did get stuck at lower levels.
Given the differences and similarities between men and women in the corporate environment, how would you suggest some successful ways of networking between men and women? I mean, this is very relevant to this region. We're pushing the agenda and pushing the bar and trying to be in those positions. But that part is really critical because that networking part, a lot of business happens through it. And most of the time, women are missing from those conversations.
Yes, that's such a great point. And it's something that, like, you know, as I've said many times now, came up a lot in the women that we spoke to, right? Often saying kind of exactly what you said is that, you know, so many decisions get made out of the formal context of the office, or decisions at least get kind of prepared for or talked about in these settings where, you know, women, you know, where women aren't there. So, you know, there's a number of things to consider here. One is, you know, what managers and organizations do to prevent that, right? So, you know, as a manager, to kind of make sure that you're not, you know, even unintentionally creating stronger bonds with people who share your gender, right? So if you're a man and you are not really, you know, necessarily comfortable, you know, having a late evening meal with your, you know, with female colleagues or reports, but you would be with men, you know, it's not really distributing your sort of social capital fairly if you engage in some of those social activities with men and not with women, right? So you need to think about how you can equalize that. So maybe it's just that you think kind of proactively about what are settings that you feel comfortable interacting with both men and women in, right? And then thinking about those settings as the place to kind of build those developmental relationships with the people who report to you, right? So that's one thing. But just in general, for kind of people in the workplace, one thing that I would really urge men to think about in terms of kind of their own networking is that investing in your female colleagues and kind of seeing them as valuable colleagues and putting time into those relationships actually really, you know, benefits you too. It's not just about doing that kind of to be nice or to be an ally. But for instance, a study that Boris did a few years ago, that some of you may have heard him talk about over the years, as I know he's shared this in other presentations, was about you know, Wall Street analysts. And one of the findings, he actually didn't go into the study looking for gender findings, but one of the things he found was that women really struggled to build the relationships that they needed with the people in their firms because their male colleagues basically did not see them as important and did not put the time into those relationships. So they were kind of at a disadvantage in an industry where who you know really matters, right? And it gets you a lot of access to information and to other people, et cetera. What the women did was they went out and they just built very strong external networks. And the ultimate result of this is that women actually were much more able to retain their same level of performance when they changed jobs. And men, actually, when they changed jobs, their performance really went down, right? Because they didn't have these external networks. And so this is an example where if men had actually just invested in their female colleagues and seen what they were doing and seen that, you know, there was something that they could learn from their female colleagues, their own performance actually would have been better. So I just think that's helpful for men to keep in mind. This is not just about doing a good deed, but it's actually about what's smart for your own career, right? Investing in the colleagues that you have, both men and women.
Thank you, Colleen. Very insightful. I have one more question from Faiz. He's saying, do you think that gender mainstreaming will become mandatory for Fortune 500 companies in the near future?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know the answer to that question. I do think, like I said, in the US, certainly, I think a lot of large companies are really at the forefront of a lot of these issues, even more so than kind of mandates from the government. And I think that large companies, you know, have an important role to play and often want to be seen as leading. What I will say is that I think in this kind of post-pandemic world, there's going to be my prediction, which I guess this is being recorded, so we'll see. We'll see if this turns out. But my prediction will be that there's going to start to be, you know, a sort of divergence between companies that are really employers of choice for women and those that are really not, and not a lot of gray area. You know, so it's going to be companies that women really want to work at and companies that talented women really don't want to work at. And Boris and I actually started hearing from women, you know, over a year ago now, at the very beginning of the pandemic, who are reaching out and really saying either, wow, I am so happy to know that I work at a company that really cares about its people, that understands the caregiving burdens that women tend to face disproportionately, and is being really thoughtful about how to, enable everybody to kind of make it through this period. Or they were saying, wow, I'm really disappointed in my company and the way it's handling, what employees need right now. And there was no gray area, right? It was very extreme. And so I think after this, kind of period in history starts to fade, and we do kind of return to some sort of new normal and economies really rebound, I think a lot of women are going to be voting with their feet. And I think, we're going to see, again, companies that talented women really flock to, or companies that talented women really flock away from. And there's going to be kind of leaders and laggards and not a lot of middle ground. So, well, you can check me on that in a few years.
Thank you, Colleen. I actually read through the book, and it has a lot of amazing information, which took a lot of time and effort to put all of this findings out to the public. What inspired you to write this book?
Oh gosh, I think one thing that we were inspired by, Boris and I, is when we continued working past the W50 on many of the things that HBS was doing around this topic. The school really leaned into thinking about how it could be a more gender equitable institution. And we were able to, for instance, launch the Gender Initiative in 2015. And that's just one example of kind of the changes and efforts that have happened. And, very much with the leadership of Nithin Noria, who was dean at the time, recently stepped down. And so I think Boris and I just really felt like this was kind of a time to seize the moment, right? And to say, let's not let all of this just fade away. Like, let's really think about how we can build something enduring out of these insights, learn from what the school is doing, really dig into the research in this area, and think about how to create something that hopefully can be really widely used by everyone to kind of, take us from where we are now to really accelerate progress. So I think we were just kind of inspired, by being at a moment in time when we felt like there was some real momentum, and we wanted to seize on that.
Absolutely. Amazing. And how can we get copies of the book?
So you can find it through HBR, the Harvard Business Review store, also Amazon, really, any kind of retailer. You should be really easy to find. So please reach out to me if you can't find it. You can definitely reach out to me directly, and you can get it, in audio, ebook, hard copy, and also, the press has some really great sort of discounts and customization options that actually start at only like 10 copies. So if it's something that any of you listening feel like this is interesting for your organization, definitely feel free to reach out to me or the press directly, and they can chat with you about doing an order if it's something that you want to share with your organization. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Colleen, for your time, for sharing your insights with the HBS Club of the GCC and the HBS MENA Research Center. You dialing in early in the morning from Boston to be here with us. We appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great conversation.
I would like to thank our audience. In Glass Half Broken, Colleen and Boris reveal the pervasive organizational obstacles and managerial actions, limited opportunities for development, lack of role models and sponsors, and bias in hiring, compensation, and promotion that create the gender imbalances. They recommend a series of best practices along critical dimensions to organizations that want to work towards parity, not for cosmetic reasons, but to improve performance and value. Get your copy today and commit to make it happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.